In this lecture, we will be examining several terms that have currency in the study of European history and culture. The Middle Ages, medieval, which is related to the Middle Ages, and feudalism. The term medieval is a term that was coined in the 15th century. The word comes from the Latin words medium, for middle, and aevum, for age. So the Middle Ages then describes in general terms the time between the Roman Empire and the Renaissance. Historians, however, are in disagreement over the exact definitions of what constitutes medieval and the subdivisions within the term medieval or Middle Ages. And some historians even dislike the very notions of creating categories like medieval to compartmentalize time. But for the basis of the purposes of our course, and to stay in alignment and consistent with how the textbook present things, we will use these terms. Dating the Middle Ages can be a bit tricky. The early Middle Ages, the beginning, could be defined at a number of different places, but somewhere at one of those dates in which the fall of Rome is considered to have happened. So here's Odoacer at 476 CE. This is a time of relatively little literary output. It's a time of fragmented political units. The emergence of feudal structures occurs in this time, F-E-U-D-A-L, which we'll talk about later in this lecture. This is a time period known for greater division between the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox churches. The High Middle Ages, roughly from 1000 to 1300 CE, noted for rapidly increasing populations in Europe, much more land being cultivated in this time period. The growth of towns is a feature of the High Middle Ages. In general, there's greater literary output, though mostly of a religious nature. There is some political consolidation that happens in this time period, if you think in terms of figures like Charlemagne. And the formal split occurs in this time between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches. The late Middle Ages, 14th, 15th, and into the 16th century, times of significant religious conflict, frequent wars. There's tremendous literary and intellectual growth happening in this time, especially in terms of secular writing. The emergence of nation states occurs in this time period, and the European expansion to other parts of the world occurs during the late Middle Ages. And again, these dates are sort of general. There are those who will argue that, for example, 1500, should it be considered early modern? Should it be considered late Middle Ages? And it really depends on the part of Europe that you're in at a given time, and really even one's own methodological biases. Some quick myths about the Middle Ages. One of the myths that these were dark ages with mass ignorance, superstition. The truth, there were many periods and examples of advanced learning at this time. Another myth, medieval kings had absolute power. But at this time, medieval kings were really like first among equals, as opposed to having absolute power. This one is one I encounter a lot, that people smelled bad and they never bathed. Personal hygiene, of course, is different in all societies, and different societies place different emphases on what is the ideal in terms of cleanliness and health and hygiene. There were parts of Europe in which bathing wasn't as prominent as others, other parts where it was practiced daily or more than once a day. So I just like to clear up a few of those myths. European feudalism. This is a socioeconomic system based on mutual obligations. These are a set of legal and military customs that emerged between the 9th and 15th or 16th centuries. The term feudal was coined in the modern era, so it wasn't necessarily used at that time. A couple of terms to be familiar with when we're talking about feudalism. The first being lord. A lord. This is a general term for a person who has significant authority or power or control over other people. A vassal is a person who has entered into a reciprocal commitment or agreement to a lord or monarch. Usually protection is offered and land use is offered in exchange for military service and other forms of service. The term fief, F-I-E-F, is land that is granted by an overlord to a vassal who held it in fealty or loyalty in return for feudal allegiance and for service. The word fief is derived from the tradition of a knight's fee, F-E-E, which was the amount of land that would be considered necessary from which a knight could gain adequate sustenance for himself and his squires, and also the means to supply himself and his attendants with enough horses and armor to fight in combat for the overlord. And different places at different periods of time defined the fee or the fief in different ways. But essentially it's again the idea of these mutual obligations that both parties, both lord and vassal, would enter into in this agreement. Here we have a fief entry from a document known as the Testa de Neville, dated 1302. This is an example of a recorded fief from the early 13th century as recorded by the English King's Lord Chancellor, whose name was Ralph Neville. So this would be the testament or document of Neville. This particular copy of the Book of Fees dates to 1302, but it has information on fees that date back much earlier. I won't bore you with the entire translation, and there's parts I can't quite make out, but it does say in the upper left-hand side, Northampton, fees of military tenants held in chief from the Lord King, and holdings in chief by the same tenants from the Lord King. Then it lists what those relationships are and who the signees are. So Eustace of Watford, if you're looking toward the bottom, holds half a fee in Watford. Richard of Linden holds a 1 fee in Eston in the county of Northampton, and a few other fees. And then Gilbert de Preston has half a fee in Gretton, and these were knights in the service of King John, and this takes place in the 12th year of the reign of King Edward, the son of King Edward in North Hampshire. So, reinforcing this idea of mutual feudal obligations, vassals pledged fealty or loyalty to lords. I better spell that word out, F-E-A-L-T-Y. Fealty is akin to loyalty. Lords then would allow vassals use of land, which is the fief. Vassal owe the lords tribute and service of some form, and certainly in times of warfare that would take on military connotations. And the lords owe the vassals protection. So mutual obligations are a significant part of feudalism. Manorialism, which is sometimes called seigneurialism, is a sort of form of feudalism. The lord controlled the land as the monarch saw fit. So this is a time before, we're very used to living in an era where there is private property, where you can just go across the street and you see a piece of land and you negotiate with the owner and you buy it and it's recorded by the government. Kings or monarchs or emperors decided which of the lords would control what land, and in turn they would have feudal obligations to the king. Under a seigneurial setup or a manorial setup, you have peasants, though, who are working the land. They are generally not free to leave the land. Peasants paid lords with service. Sometimes we use the French term corvée, C-O-R-V-E-E. And this corvée service might take the form of, say, road building or wall building or ditch digging, whatever was needed. Peasants might also pay lords with a portion of crops, or in the late Middle Ages, more peasants might actually even pay in cash. Lords, and again reinforcing this idea of mutual obligations, provided protection from invading armies and criminal gangs. Finally, one more term to discuss when talking about feudalism is the idea of serfdom, where peasants were tied to the land. They needed, for example, the lord's permission to travel, even into town. Sometimes they needed the lord's permission to marry. In a way, it's sort of a modified form of slavery. Serfs, depending on where they were in Europe. Now, Western Europe, the conditions were a little bit better or a little freer than in Eastern Europe. Probably the harshest conditions for serfs would be in the Russian Empire. But the serfs also worked lands for themselves as well as the lords. So typically a serf would have some lands he would work for the lord, some for himself. And this brings to a close our brief look at the terms Middle Ages, medieval, and feudalism.